In the British Museum, in room 55, within the Assyrian galleries, a modest clay tablet rests behind protective glass. Its catalogue number is K.1602, part of the Koyunjik collection recovered from the ruins of Nineveh in the mid-19th century. The tablet was excavated during the campaigns led by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam between 1849 and 1854, when the mound opposite Mosul yielded thousands of cuneiform fragments from the library of Ashurbanipal. Fired by accident in the destruction of the city in 612 BCE, the clay survived. The surface is uneven, the colour a muted earthen brown. Across it run lines of tightly pressed wedges, cuneiform signs impressed with a reed stylus nearly 3,000 years ago. Some edges are chipped. One corner is fractured. The script is Akkadian, written in a standardized Neo-Assyrian hand. In 1872, George Smith, an assistant in the Department of Oriental Antiquities, examined tablets from this same library and announced his translation of a flood narrative that would stir Victorian England. K.1602 belongs to the same intellectual world. Imagine standing before the case. The light is controlled, almost clinical. You lean slightly closer. The incisions are shallow but deliberate. Each wedge carries intention. Picture the surface beneath your hand. Cool, granular, unexpectedly human. Someone once held this clay while it was soft. Someone pressed meaning into it. Someone expected it to be read. The tablet contains a passage describing beings stationed between heaven and earth, figures who observe, report, and at times instruct. And later interpreters would translate similar terms as watchers, borrowing language from biblical traditions. Yet the Akkadian terminology here does not map perfectly onto later theological frameworks. The roles assigned to these intermediaries are administrative as much as cosmic. They tally, they witness, they transmit decrees. The anomaly is quiet. In this tablet, the watchers are not simply divine messengers nor rebellious angels. They appear embedded within a bureaucratic cosmology, a layered universe where oversight is structured and procedural. The text implies hierarchy, coordination, even record-keeping among celestial figures. It reads less like mythic spectacle and more like institutional memory projected onto the sky. Scholars generally interpret such language as metaphor. The gods mirror the palace. Heaven reflects empire. Yet when one traces the terminology across tablets from Nineveh to Nippur, subtle inconsistencies emerge. In some passages, the watchers seem transient. In others, they are primordial. Their placement shifts. Their authority fluctuates. They stand between realms, but not always in the same way. This is not a dramatic contradiction. It is a pattern that resists neat containment. The clay does not announce a secret. It offers a record. But within that record, a tension lingers. Why does a civilization so grounded in irrigation schedules, tax lists, and grain rations preserve detailed hierarchies of cosmic overseers? Why are celestial watchers described with language that echoes administrative offices? The answer may be entirely symbolic. Ancient societies encoded governance in divine narrative. That explanation remains strong. It may also be incomplete. Because, as we will see, civilizations remember in fragments. And sometimes, what appears as myth may carry the structural memory of something once experienced differently. Before we move further, consider this quietly. The stories we inherit about the ancient world shape the way we perceive our own position in time. We tend to imagine ourselves as the first to analyze, the first to question, the first to look back with critical distance. Yet these tablets suggest a people already reflecting on watchers, oversight, and cosmic order. Perhaps we are not the first to ask. There is no urgency here, only an invitation to observe carefully, to let the clay speak at its own pace, to allow inherited narratives to loosen slightly, not in rejection, but in curiosity. The tablet remains still behind the glass, its wedges unchanged, its watchers waiting between heaven and earth. Long before the library of Ashurbanipal was assembled in Nineveh, the southern plains of Mesopotamia had already given rise to one of the earliest urban experiments in human history. The conventional chronology is well established. During the Ubaid period, beginning around 6500 BCE, small agricultural settlements appeared along the marshes and riverbanks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Mud brick houses clustered near canals. Pottery styles became increasingly standardized. Temple platforms began to rise above the floodplain. By the 4th millennium BCE, during the Uruk period, these settlements expanded into cities. Uruk itself may have housed tens of thousands of inhabitants. Monumental architecture emerged. The Eanna precinct, massive storage facilities under administrative compounds. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets date to this era, recording barley rations, livestock counts, and labor allocations. Writing, in its earliest form, was an instrument of management. This development is not mysterious. It reflects the pressures of scale. As irrigation networks grew more complex, coordination became essential. Temple institutions functioned not only as religious centers, but as economic hubs. They organized labor, redistributed grain, and mediated access to land. By the early dynastic period, city-states such as Ur, Lagash, and Kish competed for influence. Kingship crystallized. Warfare appears in the archaeological record through fortifications and victory stele. Within this framework, the gods mirrored the structure of the city. The pantheon was ordered hierarchically. As Anu presided from the heavens, Enlil governed air and authority, Enki oversaw fresh waters and wisdom. Beneath them were lesser deities and divine functionaries. The cosmos resembled an administrative state projected upward. In this context, the watchers described in later Akkadian texts can be understood as mythological intermediaries, figures embodying surveillance, communication, and order. Their presence reflects the centralization of authority. Just as scribes monitored grain accounts, celestial beings monitored human conduct. The metaphor is coherent. Most Assyriologists maintain that such imagery evolved organically from socio-political realities. As temples grew in power, narratives of divine oversight reinforced legitimacy. The watchers are literary devices, expressions of an ordered worldview. This interpretation is neither careless nor dismissive. It is grounded in evidence. Cuneiform archives reveal meticulous accounting. Excavations at sites like Ur and Nippur demonstrate continuity in administrative practice. The transition from pictographic signs to phonetic writing unfolded gradually. There is no indication of sudden external imposition. Cultural development appears cumulative. Yet even within this cumulative narrative, interpretive tension persists. The watchers, in certain passages, act with a degree of autonomy that exceeds metaphor. They descend, they deliberate, they withdraw. Their roles shift across centuries, as though the concept itself were adapting to something remembered but not fully retained. This does not invalidate mainstream scholarship. It invites nuance. It's the accepted narrative of Sumer remains one of incremental innovation. Agriculture, urbanization, writing, statecraft. But embedded within that narrative are stories that stretch beyond irrigation schedules and temple inventories. Stories of intermediaries between heaven and earth, of knowledge transmitted and then withheld. We are not asked to abandon the conventional model, only to notice that even within a robust academic framework, complexity accumulates. The Watchers may indeed symbolize priestly authority or cosmic order. They may also encode layers of cultural memory that exceed a single explanatory lens. Civilizations often preserve multiple meanings simultaneously. In the quiet continuity from Ubaid village to Assyrian empire, from clay tokens to epic literature, one can trace both stability and adaptation. As the ground remains firm, the chronology stands. And yet, within the tablets, something unsettled continues to surface. Not as contradiction, but as depth. It is depth that requires patience. Beneath the galleries of modern museums lie deeper archives, layered not in glass cases but in earth. At Nineveh, the mound of Kuyunjik rises above the Tigris plain as a quiet swell of soil. Within it, archaeologists uncovered strata that record centuries of rebuilding, destruction, and renewal. Each layer corresponds to occupation. Each occupation leaves residue. The tablets of Ashurbanipal's library were not discovered in orderly shelves. They were found in collapsed rooms, scattered across floors blackened by fire. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, wooden beams burned and roofs caved in. The intense heat hardened many clay tablets, preserving them inadvertently. What had been administrative documents and literary texts became archaeological artifacts. At Nippur, further south, excavation revealed a different rhythm. Temple precincts were rebuilt repeatedly atop earlier foundations. Brick by brick, centuries accumulated. In certain trenches, archaeologists documented more than 20 distinct building phases. Between these phases lay ash layers, flood deposits and debris, interruptions in continuity. Stratigraphy teaches a simple principle. What survives is selective. Clay endures, wood decays. Oral traditions vanish unless inscribed. Entire dimensions of ancient life disappear without leaving a trace. The material record privileges what can withstand time and catastrophe. It preserves fragments. Civilizations remember in fragments. When tablets were archived in temple libraries, they represented curated memory. Scribal authorities chose what to copy and preserve. Hymns, rituals, omen lists, epics. These texts were not random. They reflected priorities. When later generations unearthed them, they encountered not the totality of Sumerian thought, but its surviving archive. Even within a single archive, gaps are visible. Broken edges interrupt lines. Missing fragments create lacunae that modern translators attempt to reconstruct through parallel copies. Sometimes entire passages are inferred. Sometimes they remain lost. The Watchers appear within this fragmentary landscape. Their descriptions vary from tablet to tablet. In one text, they serve as attendants to greater gods. In another, they participate in deliberations affecting humanity. But the discontinuities in preservation complicate interpretation. Are we observing conceptual evolution, regional variation, or simply the uneven survival of texts. Imagine descending through the excavation trench at Nippur. The soil shifts colour with each occupational phase, light tan to darker brown, then grey where ash settled. You brush away dust from a shard of clay. It bears only a partial sign. The rest is gone. You hold not a complete narrative, but a remnant. This is how ancient memory reaches us, through shards. The discipline of archaeology insists on caution. Context determines meaning. A tablet without stratigraphic data is diminished. A fragment without provenience invites misreading. Yet even with careful documentation, interpretation requires inference. The archive speaks softly. What emerges from Nineveh and Nippur is not a singular, unified voice, but a chorus interrupted by time. Administrative texts dominate numerically. Literary compositions survive in fewer copies. The Watchers appear within this minority of mythic and cosmological texts, embedded within larger frameworks of order. Their presence, therefore, is both marginal and persistent. Marginal in quantity, persistent in recurrence. As we proceed, it is essential to remember that our understanding is shaped not only by what was written, but by what survived writing's destruction. Clay preserves what fire touches. It does not preserve everything equally. Civilizations remember in fragments, and fragments, when arranged carefully, can suggest patterns, never complete, but resonant. To understand the Watchers within Mesopotamian tradition, each one must move slowly through the texts themselves, tracing terminology across centuries and languages. The Sumerian corpus predates the Akkadian compositions preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. In the earliest Sumerian hymns and temple inscriptions, the divine assembly is referred to collectively as the Anunna, offspring of An, the sky god. They appear as decision-makers, adjudicators of fate, seated within a structured council. In later Akkadian texts, another group emerges more distinctly: the Igigi. The Igigi are often portrayed as younger gods, subordinate yet numerous. In certain mythological narratives, they perform labor on behalf of higher deities. In the Atrahasis epic, preserved on old Babylonian tablets from the 18th century BCE, the Igigi rebel against the burdens placed upon them. The resulting crisis leads to the creation of humanity, who inherit the work. Here the language shifts from distant transcendence to structured delegation. The divine realm resembles an administration. The Watchers, though not always labelled explicitly as such in Sumerian, appear conceptually aligned with these intermediary figures. They observe, report, and participate in cosmic governance. In some lexical lists and omen texts, celestial phenomena are interpreted as communications from divine observers. The sky becomes not merely backdrop, but monitored domain. The Apkallu traditions add another layer. These semi-divine sages, associated with the antediluvian period, are described in later Assyrian reliefs as fish-cloaked figures emerging from the waters, bringing knowledge to humanity. Textual sources, such as the Beat Mezeri incantation series, list 7 primordial Apkallu who advised early kings. They are described as possessing extraordinary wisdom, instructed by the god Enki. Descent, instruction, withdrawal. This pattern repeats. The Apkallu appear before the flood. After the flood, they no longer function in the same way. Human sages replace them. The narrative implies a transition from direct divine mediation to mediated knowledge through priesthood and scholarship. We are not the first to ask. The Mesopotamians themselves asked why knowledge seemed to diminish over time, why the sages of the past were greater, why the earliest kings reigned for impossibly long spans. Their texts encode nostalgia as well as authority. In the Sumerian king list, rulers before the flood are assigned reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reign lengths contract dramatically. The shift is abrupt, yet formulaic. Modern scholars interpret these figures symbolically, perhaps representing dynastic legitimacy rather than literal chronology. Yet the structure conveys a message. There was an earlier order. The Watchers occupy a liminal position within this structure. In some later Jewish texts, such as the Book of the Watchers within the Enochic tradition, they descend and transgress, teaching forbidden knowledge. Mesopotamian texts do not narrate the same moral drama, yet they share architectural similarities, intermediary beings interacting with humanity, then receding. Another way to read this is through linguistic drift. Terms evolve. Concepts migrate across cultures. Akkadian influence spreads westward. The Aramaic and Hebrew traditions absorb and reinterpret motifs. The Watchers become moralized in later frameworks. What began as administrative cosmology becomes theological narrative. The textual evidence supports diffusion. It does not demand supernatural interpretation, yet the persistence of structural motifs across millennia invites reflection. The Mesopotamian divine assembly functions as a council, deliberating fate. The Igigi perform labor and revolt. The Apkallu instruct and vanish. Across variations, one constant remains. Humanity is not alone at the top of its narrative. There are overseers, teachers, intermediaries. The sky was once closer. In early astronomical texts, celestial bodies are catalogued meticulously. Stars are assigned to deities. Movements are tracked. Omens are derived from planetary conjunctions. So the heavens are active, communicative. The boundary between observation and participation blurs. If the cosmos is structured, it is also monitored. The Watchers may symbolize priestly authority projected onto the sky. They may encode memories of earlier cosmologies, now partially obscured. Some researchers have proposed that mythic intermediaries function as repositories of institutional memory, embodying transitions between knowledge systems. If we consider the possibility that narratives preserve layered meanings, then the Watchers become more than literary ornament. They become signals, not of alien visitation, not of hidden empires, but of a civilization wrestling with its own origins, its own authority, its own relationship to knowledge. Civilizations remember in fragments. Texts preserve patterns. Patterns invite comparison. Yet caution remains essential. The evidence supports structured cosmology and evolving theology. It does not compel dramatic revision. Still, within the clay tablets and copied epics, an echo persists. An awareness that there were once beings who stood between heaven and earth, who instructed and withdrew, who observed and recorded. We are not the first to ask what that means, and the asking continues quietly across time. Among the most enduring figures within Mesopotamian tradition are the Apkallu, the antediluvian sages whose memory stretches backward into a time described as different from our own. Their names appear in ritual texts, incantation series, and king lists compiled centuries after the period they claim to describe. They are associated with the era before the flood. a boundary event dividing primordial time from historical time. The Sumerian king list provides a structural framework for this division. In its various manuscript traditions, it begins with the statement that kingship descended from heaven. The first city to receive this kingship is Eridu. The earliest rulers are assigned reigns lasting 28,800 years, 36,000 years even longer. After several such dynasties, the text states simply, "Then the flood swept over." The line is spare, the shift is absolute. Modern scholarship approaches these enormous reign lengths symbolically. They may represent numerological systems tied to the sexagesimal base of Mesopotamian mathematics. They may encode dynastic prestige or mythic time rather than literal chronology. There is no credible archaeological evidence for human lifespans extending tens of millennia. Yet the structure of the narrative remains significant. Before the flood, time expands. After the flood, it contracts. Kingship continues, but its scale diminishes. The pattern suggests not only catastrophe, but transformation. The Apkallu belong to this earlier era. Later Assyrian texts, such as those associated with the Beit Meseri corpus, list 7 primordial sages created by the god Enki. They are described as extraordinarily wise, guardians of ritual purity, advisors to kings. Artistic depictions from the Neo-Assyrian period portray them as hybrid figures, human in form, cloaked in fish skins, sometimes holding ritual buckets and cones. The imagery is complex. Water surrounds them. Enki, their divine patron, is the god of the subterranean freshwater abyss, the Apsu. Knowledge emerges from water. Civilization rises from marshland. The Apkallu are mediators between divine wisdom and human society. After the flood, however, the tradition changes. The texts begin to refer to post-Diluvian sages, human scholars who inherit the mantle of knowledge. The extraordinary qualities of the primordial Apkallu recede into memory. The institutionalized priesthood takes their place. This has happened before. Civilizations imagine a golden age of superior knowledge, then narrate its loss. One interpretation suggests that the antediluvian reign lengths and sage traditions function as mythic legitimization of kingship. By projecting authority into a distant, almost unreachable past, later dynasties ground their own rule in divine continuity. Yet another way to read this is as encoded memory of environmental transition. If significant flooding events altered settlement patterns in southern Mesopotamia, oral traditions may have crystallized around that rupture. Archaeological surveys of early Sumerian sites reveal periodic flood deposits. At Ashurbanipal and thick layers of riverine sediment separate occupational phases. These floods were likely local or regional rather than global. Yet to inhabitants whose world was defined by river valleys, such events would have appeared total. The Apkallu, situated before the flood, represent knowledge anchored in a world that no longer exists. Imagine standing at the edge of a marsh at dawn. The horizon is low. Water reflects the sky. A reed boat moves slowly across the surface. The environment feels primordial yet fragile. And now imagine that this landscape shifts. Channels change, settlements relocate, memory fractures. Knowledge becomes inheritance rather than experience. We are not the first to ask what was lost. The extraordinary reign lengths may also reflect alternative conceptions of time. Mesopotamian mathematics was sophisticated. Astronomical cycles were observed carefully. Some scholars have proposed that mythic durations encode astronomical periods, precessional cycles or calendrical systems abstracted into narrative form. If we consider the possibility that the numbers are symbolic compressions of observational data, the king list becomes more than legend. It becomes a mnemonic device. Yet such interpretations remain tentative. The prevailing view continues to favor literary symbolism over literal chronology. Yes, the evidence for a technologically advanced lost civilization in prehistoric Mesopotamia is absent. Excavations reveal gradual development, pottery styles evolving, architecture becoming more complex, writing emerging from accounting practices. The Apkallu, therefore, may represent the human need to situate knowledge within a lineage that precedes memory. They embody continuity across rupture. Civilizations remember in fragments. They also remember through magnification. By assigning impossible spans to early kings and extraordinary wisdom to primordial sages, Mesopotamian scribes constructed a narrative architecture in which the present was grounded in an expansive past. The flood served as hinge. Before it, the sky felt nearer. After it, the world stabilized into something recognizably human. The Watchers, the Apkallu, as the divine assembly, all belong to this architecture. They do not demand belief in vanished super-civilization. They do suggest that ancient societies were deeply conscious of discontinuity, of something once closer, then withdrawn. This has happened before. The pattern of ascent, rupture, and recalibration echoes across their texts, quiet yet persistent. As Mesopotamian influence extended westward through trade, migration, and imperial expansion, its literary and cosmological motifs traveled as well. By the first millennium BCE, communities in the Levant were composing texts that would later form part of the Hebrew Bible and associated apocryphal literature. Within this textual landscape, the figure of the Watcher reappears with altered emphasis. In the Book of Daniel, written in Aramaic during the Hellenistic period, a dream narrative describes a watcher, a holy one, descending from heaven to announce judgment upon a king. The term used, in Aramaic, shares semantic territory with Akkadian concepts of vigilance and divine observation. The watcher in Daniel functions as messenger and arbiter, participating in a celestial decree. Later, in the Book of the Watchers, part of the Anunnaki corpus dated to the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, the narrative expands. Here, a group of watchers descends to Earth, intermingles with humanity, and transmits forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology. Their descent leads to corruption and eventual punishment. The moral tone differs markedly from Mesopotamian texts, yet the architectural structure remains recognizable. Intermediary beings crossing a boundary, imparting instruction, then withdrawing or being removed. Descent, instruction, withdrawal. The pattern persists. Most scholars interpret these parallels through cultural transmission. During the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah came under Mesopotamian influence. Exile communities in Babylon would have encountered Akkadian mythic traditions. Concepts migrated, were translated, and adapted to new theological frameworks. This process does not require hidden continuity. It reflects historical contact. Yet the structural similarities are notable. In both traditions, watchers occupy a liminal space between divine and human realms. In Mesopotamia, they reinforce cosmic administration. In the Enochic literature, they dramatize transgression. The moral valence shifts, but the architecture of intermediary oversight remains. One interpretation suggests that as monotheistic theology solidified, older polytheistic frameworks were reframed as narratives of rebellion and judgment. What had once been divine functionaries became fallen beings. Another way to read this is as a reorientation of authority, transferring cosmic hierarchy into ethical drama. The sky was once closer. In earlier Mesopotamian cosmology, the heavens and earth interacted through structured channels. Omens, rituals, priestly interpretation. In later Levantine texts, the boundary becomes more rigid, and descent becomes exceptional rather than routine. The Watcher's crossing is disruptive. We are not the first to ask how narratives evolve. Cultural memory does not remain static. It refracts through language, politics, and theology. The Watchers of Mesopotamia and the Watchers of Enoch share structural DNA, yet they inhabit different moral universes. The parallels invite reflection, not conclusion. They demonstrate that ideas migrate across landscapes, adapt to new contexts, and carry traces of earlier forms. They also show how intermediary figures serve as narrative tools for negotiating authority, knowledge, and cosmic order. Civilizations remember in fragments. Fragments travel. What began as administrative cosmology in the city-states of Sumer may have been reinterpreted centuries later as ethical allegory in Second Temple Judaism. The transformation does not diminish the earlier tradition. It reveals continuity beneath change. The Watchers remain between heaven and earth, though their roles shift, and the questions surrounding them continue to unfold across time. If one steps even further back from the Near Eastern landscape and surveys distant civilizations, structural echoes begin to appear again, this time separated not merely by language, but by oceans and millennia. These parallels must be approached cautiously. There is no direct evidence of contact between ancient Mesopotamia and pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. There is no documented transmission between early Sumer and Vedic India. Yet narrative architecture can converge independently when human societies confront similar existential pressures. In Mesoamerican traditions, particularly within the Popol Vuh of the Quiche Maya, there are accounts of prior creations, worlds formed and destroyed before the current age of humanity. Divine beings intervene, instruct, withdraw, and attempt again. Knowledge is given and withheld. The present humanity emerges after earlier attempts fail. This has happened before. The repetition is structural rather than genealogical. In early Indo-Iranian traditions preserved in the Avesta, the figure of Yima presides over a golden age that eventually collapses under cosmic winter. In Vedic literature, sages mediate between gods and humans, preserving ritual knowledge across cycles of creation and dissolution. The concept of recurring world ages, yugas, organizes time into expansive rhythms far exceeding a single human lifespan. Descent, instruction, withdrawal. The pattern surfaces again. One interpretation suggests that such motifs arise naturally in agrarian societies dependent on environmental stability. Catastrophic floods, droughts, or climatic shifts would imprint themselves deeply into collective memory. Another way to read these patterns is through cognitive architecture. Human beings construct narratives of origin and decline to make sense of impermanence. Civilizations remember in fragments. Sometimes they also remember through recurrence. The similarities across distant cultures do not require a single lost progenitor civilization. Convergent myth-making can generate analogous structures. When societies reflect on their origins, they often imagine earlier ages of greater knowledge. When they experience catastrophe, they encode it as cosmic reset. When they centralize authority, they project it into heaven. Yet the recurrence remains quietly striking. In multiple regions, intermediary beings or sages connect divine order with human society. In multiple traditions, floods or winters divide time into before and after. In multiple cosmologies, knowledge diminishes or transforms across cycles. The sky was once closer. This phrase need not imply physical proximity. It may express psychological orientation, a sense that the boundary between human and cosmic order felt permeable in earlier narrative frameworks. As societies rationalize and institutionalize, that boundary becomes more abstract. If we consider the possibility that these structural parallels reflect deep-seated human responses to environmental instability and social complexity, the watchers of Mesopotamia join a wider conversation. They are not isolated anomalies. They are expressions within a global pattern of mythic reasoning. The pattern does not prove shared origin. It suggests shared concerns, and perhaps shared questions. At this point in the journey, it may be worth pausing briefly, not to resolve the parallels, but to notice them. When similar narrative shapes emerge across continents without direct contact, what does that reveal about human memory? About the ways we frame knowledge and loss? About how we imagine oversight, instruction and rupture? There is no single answer required here, only reflection. The watchers, whether in Mesopotamia or refracted through distant traditions, stand within a recurring architecture, a world shaped, interrupted, and reshaped again. This has happened before, and each culture remembers it differently. Long before cities rose along the Euphrates, before cuneiform was pressed into clay, the planet itself underwent abrupt transitions. The late Pleistocene was not a stable epoch, and it oscillated between glacial advance and retreat, punctuated by episodes of rapid climatic disruption. One of the most studied of these events is the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions beginning approximately 12,900 years ago and lasting roughly 12 centuries. Ice core data from Greenland provide the primary evidence. Within those cores, layers of trapped air record temperature shifts with remarkable precision. The isotopic signatures reveal that average temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere dropped sharply within a matter of decades. Such speed challenges assumptions of gradual change. The causes remain debated. Massive meltwater influx disrupting oceanic circulation, atmospheric feedback loops, or possibly extraterrestrial impact hypotheses proposed by some researchers. Yet the prevailing model emphasizes meltwater pulses. As the great ice sheets covering North America and northern Europe began to retreat, vast glacial lakes formed. If these lakes drained suddenly into the North Atlantic, they could have weakened the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, reducing heat transport northward and triggering rapid cooling. Geological evidence for meltwater pulse 1A and other sea level accelerations supports the existence of dramatic hydrological change during this period. Sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower at the height of the last glacial maximum than they are today. As ice melted, Coastlines migrated inland. River systems adjusted. Low-lying regions flooded gradually in some cases, more abruptly in others. For communities living near shifting shorelines or river deltas, such changes would have been profound. It is within this broader context that Holocene civilizations eventually emerged. By around 9600 BCE, as the Younger Dryas ended and temperatures stabilized, agriculture began to take root in multiple regions. In the Near East, sites such as Göbekli Tepe indicate complex ritual activity even before full agricultural domestication. Sedentism expanded. Over millennia, villages grew into towns and towns into cities. The memory of climatic volatility, however, did not vanish. One interpretation suggests that flood narratives in Mesopotamia may preserve distant echoes of earlier environmental disruptions. This does not require a single global deluge. Localized catastrophic flooding along the Tigris and Euphrates is well documented in the archaeological record, so thick alluvial deposits separate occupation layers at multiple sites. Yet the emotional weight of flood narratives may extend beyond individual events. If we consider the possibility that oral traditions carry compressed memories of environmental instability, the persistence of flood motifs becomes understandable. Communities that experienced recurring inundation would encode such events into cosmology. Over generations, the scale might expand within narrative imagination, even if the physical events were regional. Scientific data does not confirm myth, it contextualizes it. The Younger Dryas hypothesis linking cometary impact to widespread destruction remains controversial. Evidence cited by proponents, microspherules, nanodiamonds, unusual sediment layers, has been challenged by other researchers who question dating consistency and replication. The debate illustrates the caution required when bridging geology and narrative. Climate science offers mechanisms, not metaphors. Yet mechanisms influence human experience. When rivers flood unpredictably, agricultural cycles falter. When temperatures shift, ecosystems reorganize. These pressures shape migration, settlement patterns, and social organization. In southern Mesopotamia, irrigation became essential precisely because the natural flood regime of the rivers was irregular. The sky was once closer, not because it descended physically, but because celestial patterns became vital to survival. Tracking seasons through star movements helped anticipate agricultural cycles. But astronomical awareness intertwined with environmental uncertainty. Civilizations remember in fragments. Geological strata preserve physical evidence. Myths preserve psychological impressions. Neither alone provides total explanation. Together, they form a layered account of adaptation. The late Pleistocene and early Holocene were periods of transformation. Human societies responded creatively, developing agriculture, architecture, ritual complexity. The Watchers in this broader frame emerged not from alien intervention, but from a world where oversight of seasons, rivers, and resources was essential. If there were intermediaries between heaven and earth, they may have symbolized the attempt to read a volatile sky and to survive beneath it. In the city of Shuruppak, identified with the modern site of Farah in southern Iraq, its excavations in the early 20th century uncovered a striking layer of riverine silt. Beneath it lay earlier occupational strata. Above it, evidence of rebuilding. The sediment layer measured several meters thick in some trenches, composed of fine alluvium consistent with flood deposition. Radiocarbon analysis and ceramic typology place this flood layer around the late 3rd millennium BCE. A similar pattern appears at Ur. Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating in the 1920s and 1930s, documented a thick deposit of clean clay between two habitation levels. At first, Woolley interpreted this as evidence of a single great flood, perhaps corresponding to the deluge described in Mesopotamian epic. Later research suggested that these deposits were local events, not uniform across the entire region, as different sites show flood layers at different times. The archaeological picture is therefore complex. Flooding was recurrent. The Tigris and Euphrates do not behave like the Nile. Their inundations are less predictable. Snowmelt in the Anatolian highlands, combined with seasonal rains, produces variable discharge. A levee breach in one year can devastate a settlement, while nearby areas remain relatively unaffected. Over centuries, river channels migrate laterally across the floodplain, abandoning old courses and carving new ones. Within this hydrological context, the flood narrative of the Atrahasis epic and the later epic of Gilgamesh takes on a grounded dimension. In these texts, the gods decide to send a flood to reduce human noise or overpopulation. A favoured individual, Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, is warned, constructs a vessel, and survives. Afterward, sacrifice is offered, and new constraints are placed upon humanity. The story is structured. It is not a geological report, yet it likely draws upon lived experience of catastrophic inundation. When Shurupak's flood layer is examined, it does not correspond to a global event. It reflects a powerful local flood that interrupted urban continuity. For those who experienced it, however, the scale may have felt absolute. Civilizations remember in fragments. A regional flood can become a cosmic deluge in narrative memory. One interpretation suggests that the Sumerian king list's placement of the flood between dynasties mirrors actual discontinuities observed in the archaeological record. Settlement abandonment, population shifts and rebuilding phases punctuate early Mesopotamian history. An oral tradition may have fused multiple flood events into a single archetypal rupture. Another way to read this is through literary convention. Flood myths appear in multiple cultures. They serve as mechanisms for resetting order, purifying corruption, and legitimizing new authority. The Mesopotamian version situates the flood within a divine council deliberation, again reinforcing structured oversight. The Watchers are not central actors in the flood epic, yet they belong to the same cosmological system. If intermediary beings observe and report human behavior, their presence implies accountability. The flood, in narrative terms, becomes a response to imbalance. Whether understood symbolically or as compressed memory of real hydrological disasters, the structure conveys a civilization grappling with vulnerability. Imagine standing at the edge of the Euphrates after days of relentless rain. The water has risen beyond its banks. Mud brick walls soften, livestock struggle, grain stores dissolve into slurry. When the waters finally recede, the landscape is altered. Foundations are gone. The horizon feels unfamiliar. Such experiences imprint deeply. They generate stories that outlast the sediment. Archaeology confirms that floods occurred. It does not confirm a single worldwide inundation in the time frame described by Mesopotamian texts. Geological records show no evidence of a global flood in the 3rd millennium BCE. The regional interpretation remains the most credible. Yet the narrative power of the flood persists because it captures a truth beyond scale. Societies are fragile. This has happened before. Cities rise along rivers. Rivers shift. A memory reorganizes itself around rupture. The stratigraphic record at Shuruppak and Ur demonstrates continuity interrupted by disaster and followed by renewal. The texts encode that interruption in mythic language. Between the layers of silt and the lines of cuneiform, a dialogue emerges between material evidence and narrative imagination. Neither negates the other. Together, they reveal a people attentive to cycles of destruction and reconstruction, aware that what stands today may not stand tomorrow. And in that awareness, the sky remains watchful. Among the most revealing artifacts of Mesopotamian intellectual life are not epics or hymns, but astronomical tablets. Texts such as mul.apin, compiled in the late 2nd millennium BCE, but drawing upon earlier observational traditions, catalogue the rising and setting of stars, the paths of constellations, and the timing of solstices and equinoxes. These tablets do not read as poetry. They read as records. Lists of stars are arranged into 3 paths: the path of Enlil, the path of Anu, and the path of Ea. Each path corresponds to a band of the sky. The classification is systematic. Constellations are assigned months. Heliacal risings are noted. Lunar eclipses are predicted through accumulated data. The sky was once closer, not in distance but in attention. For agrarian societies, celestial regularity provided orientation amid terrestrial uncertainty. If rivers flooded unpredictably, stars did not. The predictable cycles of Venus, recorded in the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, offered patterns that could be tracked across decades. Priests and scholars developed mathematical schemes to forecast eclipses, refine calendars, and align ritual with season. This was disciplined observation. The watchers, in such a context, take on layered meaning. They may symbolize not supernatural surveillance, but the act of watching itself, the institutionalization of sky observation. The term watcher aligns with vigilance, with sustained attention directed upward. When celestial phenomena were interpreted as omens, it was because someone was observing carefully. The relationship between astronomy and divination was intimate. Omen series such as Enuma Anu Enlil catalogued correlations between planetary positions and terrestrial events. If Mars appeared in a particular constellation, it might signify political unrest. If an eclipse occurred in a certain month, it might portend instability. Modern readers often separate astronomy from astrology. In ancient Mesopotamia, the two were entwined. The heavens were not distant abstractions. They were active participants in earthly affairs. Some researchers have proposed that long-term astronomical cycles, including the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble of Earth's axis completing a full cycle roughly every 26,000 years, may have influenced ancient cosmologies. There is limited evidence that Mesopotamian scholars explicitly recognized precession as such, though they were attentive to gradual stellar shifts over generations. If we consider the possibility that cumulative observation of the sky created an awareness of cyclical recurrence beyond a single lifetime, Their narratives of world ages and prior orders acquire additional resonance. Astronomical cycles extend far beyond human lifespan. They invite contemplation of deep time, so we are not the first to ask. The scribes who compiled mul.apin were already situated within a lineage of observation stretching backward centuries. They inherited star lists, refined them, and transmitted them forward. Knowledge accumulated slowly, through repetition and correction. Civilizations remember in fragments. Astronomical records preserve fragments of the sky's behavior. When aligned with mythic structures, they suggest a world view in which heaven and earth were integrated through measurement and meaning. One interpretation suggests that the watchers may encode this fusion of observation and governance. Just as temple officials monitored grain and labor, priest astronomers monitored celestial movement. The cosmos itself became an administrative field. Another way to read this is metaphorical. The divine council, populated by watcher figures, reflects the projection of earthly hierarchy into the sky. As societies became more bureaucratic, their cosmologies mirrored that structure. Neither reading requires abandonment of scholarly caution. The tablets of mul.apin, the Venus tablet, the Omen series, all attest to rigorous engagement with the heavens. They reveal a civilization deeply attentive to patterns. The watchers, in this broader context, become embodiments of that attentiveness. If the sky felt closer, it was because it was watched continuously. In the quiet intervals between observations, perhaps ancient scholars sensed something else as well, that cycles extended beyond their comprehension, that stars shifted slowly across ages, that time itself moved in rhythms larger than empire. This has happened before. Empires rise beneath the same constellations that shone on earlier cities. The stars endure while political orders change. The watchers may stand as narrative symbols of this enduring vigilance, a reminder that observation outlasts authority, and that the sky remains, patient and patterned, above every reconstruction. While clay tablets preserve written memory and stratigraphy preserves material disruption, another archive lies within the human body itself. Advances in population genetics over the past several decades have allowed researchers to reconstruct broad patterns of migration, expansion, and contraction across deep time. These reconstructions do not narrate events in words. They trace lineage through DNA variation. One of the most discussed hypotheses concerning ancient population contraction is the Toba bottleneck theory. Approximately 74,000 years ago, the Toba super-eruption in present-day Indonesia released vast quantities of volcanic ash into the atmosphere. Some scientists have proposed that this event triggered a severe volcanic winter, drastically reducing global human populations. Genetic studies once suggested a marked reduction in diversity consistent with a bottleneck. More recent research complicates this interpretation, indicating regional variation and resilience rather than near extinction. The debate illustrates caution. Genetic data rarely offers singular conclusions. What is more firmly established is that human populations expanded significantly during the Holocene, particularly after the development of agriculture. As sedentary life spread across the Near East around 10,000 years ago, population density increased. A genetic sampling from ancient remains in Anatolia and the Levant demonstrates gradual admixture between hunter-gatherers and early farmers. Mesopotamia became a corridor of exchange, not an isolated cradle. Ancient DNA retrieved from burial sites in northern Iraq and surrounding regions indicates continuity alongside migration. There is no evidence of a sudden replacement by a radically different population in the time frame of early Sumerian urbanization. Cultural transformation appears to have occurred largely through internal development and regional interaction. This has happened before. Societies change without wholesale biological replacement. If we consider the possibility that myths of flood and renewal encode demographic disruption, genetics provides a moderating lens. While local populations may have declined due to environmental stress or conflict, there is no indication of a total reset in the 3rd millennium BCE. Human continuity persisted. Genetic bottlenecks, when they occur, leave measurable signatures. Reduced heterozygosity, shared haplogroups, constrained diversity. Such signatures are detectable across tens of thousands of years. In the Near Eastern context, the most significant shifts correspond to the transition from foraging to farming and later to Bronze Age mobility. Civilizations remember in fragments. Genes remember differently. They preserve traces of movement, intermarriage, survival. They do not preserve narrative. They do not confirm mythic ages of extraordinary beings. They reveal gradual adaptation and resilience. But some researchers have proposed that demographic contractions caused by climatic shifts at the end of the Younger Dryas may have influenced early Holocene societies. Archaeological evidence supports settlement abandonment in certain regions, followed by reoccupation. Yet these shifts reflect fluctuation rather than extinction. We are not the first to endure disruption. Population history demonstrates that humanity has repeatedly navigated environmental volatility. The emergence of urban Mesopotamia was not the beginning of human organization. It was a culmination of millennia of experimentation. Within this broader genetic continuity, the Watchers appear not as markers of biological rupture, but as narrative devices embedded within stable populations. Yes, there is no genetic evidence for non-human intermediaries influencing early Sumerian society. The data supports human authorship, human adaptation, human continuity. This does not diminish the symbolic power of the Watchers. It situates them. When ancient texts describe beings between heaven and earth, genetics reminds us that the storytellers themselves were continuous with earlier generations. The rupture encoded in myth was cultural or environmental, not species level. The sky may have felt closer, the flood may have felt absolute. Yet beneath those experiences, lineages endured. And endurance too becomes part of the pattern. Within the cities of Sumer and later Babylonia and Assyria, knowledge was not diffuse, it was concentrated. The Edubba, literally the tablet house, served as scribal school, archive, and intellectual training ground. Excavations at Nippur and other sites have uncovered rooms filled with discarded practice tablets, lexical lists, and student exercises. The education of a scribe was disciplined and prolonged. Students copied sign lists repeatedly. They memorized proverbs. They learned to write Sumerian long after it ceased to be a spoken language, preserving it as a scholarly tongue. Akkadian became the vernacular of empire, yet Sumerian remained the language of ritual and prestige. Knowledge was layered, inherited, curated. The priesthood operated within this framework. Temple complexes functioned as both religious and administrative institutions. Ritual specialists, diviners, astronomers, and exorcists belong to professional lineages. Authority passed through apprenticeship. Its texts were recopied generation after generation, preserving continuity even as interpretation shifted. Civilizations remember in fragments. Institutions attempt to organize those fragments. The Watchers, when viewed through this lens, may reflect the projection of priestly roles into cosmology. Just as scribes monitored accounts and diviners interpreted omens, celestial intermediaries monitored human behavior and conveyed divine decrees. The structure of heaven mirrored the structure of the temple. One interpretation suggests that as knowledge centralized, narratives adapted to reinforce that centralization. By situating ultimate oversight within a divine council populated by watchers, human hierarchies gained cosmic precedent. Authority appeared natural, even inevitable. Another way to read this is psychological. In complex societies, such individuals often feel distant from decision-making structures. Projecting order into the heavens can provide reassurance that chaos is supervised, that events are not random. The Watcher becomes an embodiment of coherence. The sky was once closer, not only because stars were observed, but because ritual synchronized earth and heaven. Calendars aligned festivals with celestial events. Omens connected planetary motion with royal policy. The Edaba trained individuals to interpret these connections with precision. Yet knowledge also narrows. When expertise concentrates within specialized institutions, access becomes restricted. The memory of earlier, perhaps more participatory forms of cosmology may linger as mythic recollection. The Apkallu of the antediluvian age, dispensing wisdom directly, is contrast with later human scholars who mediate access. This has happened before. Cultures often narrate earlier ages of open knowledge, followed by periods of restriction. Whether such ages ever existed as imagined is secondary. The narrative reflects tension between collective memory and institutional authority. Archaeological evidence from scribal quarters reveals both rigor and repetition. Students practice the same signs endlessly. Lexical lists standardized meaning. Variation diminished, stability increased. The Watchers in this stabilized system may symbolize both aspiration and limitation. They stand as idealized overseers of knowledge, figures who possess comprehensive vision in contrast to human partiality. We are not the first to construct institutions that guard information. As the Mesopotamian priesthood refined astronomical observation and ritual precision, their cosmology evolved accordingly. Heaven became more ordered, the divine council more structured, the Watcher more defined. And within this ordered cosmos, the tension between inherited memory and institutional control quietly persisted. Up to this point, the evidence has been cumulative and restrained. Clay tablets, stratigraphic layers, astronomical records, genetic data, institutional structures, each contributes to a portrait of gradual development and patterned adaptation. The Watchers have appeared as literary intermediaries, symbolic projections of administration, embodiments of observational practice. These explanations remain credible. And yet, the persistence of certain motifs invites a cautious widening of perspective. If we consider the possibility that myth sometimes encodes experiences no longer directly accessible, another interpretive layer becomes visible. One interpretation suggests that the Watchers represent memory of knowledge transitions. moments when new technologies or cosmological frameworks entered a culture and felt transformative. To later generations, such shifts might appear as descent from above. Some researchers have proposed that the extraordinary reign lengths in the Sumerian king list compress astronomical cycles into narrative time. If numbers such as 28,800 correspond symbolically to calendrical systems or precessional markers, then the antediluvian age becomes a coded reference to observational epochs rather than literal lifespans. This interpretation remains speculative. It is not widely accepted, yet it demonstrates how myth can function as mnemonic architecture. Another way to read the Watchers is through socio-political transformation. As urbanization intensified, governance grew more complex. Surveillance, record-keeping, and hierarchy expanded. If we consider the possibility that the Divine Watchers symbolize early forms of institutional oversight, perhaps even collective memory of a period when social organization changed rapidly, the narrative takes on structural depth. There is also the question of environmental rupture. If climatic volatility during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene created generational memory of instability, then stories of descent and withdrawal may reflect transitions between ecological regimes. Knowledge appropriate to one environment may lose relevance in another. The Watchers instruct, then recede, because the world itself has shifted. Civilizations remember in fragments. Fragments can crystallize into archetype. One interpretation suggests that the recurrence of Watcher-like figures across cultures reflects deep-seated cognitive patterns. Our inclination to externalize authority, to imagine overseers beyond ourselves. Another possibility, more provocative yet still restrained, is that ancient peoples experienced forms of knowledge transmission through migration, contact, or innovation that felt discontinuous enough to be mythologized. If we consider the possibility that early centers of ritual complexity, such as Göbekli Tepe, indicate social coordination prior to agriculture, then our linear models of development may require nuance. This does not imply lost super-technologies. No, it suggests that human capability has oscillated in ways not fully captured by simplified timelines. The sky was once closer. In speculative reading, this phrase might signal a period when cosmology and daily survival were inseparable, when celestial cycles structured identity so profoundly that heaven and earth felt contiguous. As scientific abstraction grew, that intimacy diminished. This has happened before. Societies often narrate an earlier unity followed by fragmentation. Whether that unity was material or psychological remains open. Some researchers have proposed extraterrestrial interpretations of Watcher traditions. Such hypotheses attract attention but lack credible empirical support. No archaeological evidence demonstrates non-human intervention in Mesopotamian development. It is essential to state this clearly. Yet speculation must widen perspective without eroding integrity. The more grounded widening lies in acknowledging that human history is layered with discontinuities, environmental, cultural, institutional. When narratives speak of descent, instruction, and withdrawal, they may encode memory of transition. We are not the first to ask whether our present frameworks are complete. Speculative thought, when disciplined, does not destabilize evidence. It invites humility. It recognizes that texts may contain meanings not immediately transparent to modern readers. It also recognizes the limits of inference. The watchers stand at the threshold between known and unknown, not as proof of hidden civilizations, but as reminders that interpretation is iterative. Each generation rereads the clay, re-examines the sediment, reinterprets the stars. And civilizations remember in fragments. Fragments accumulate into patterns. Patterns suggest possibilities. And possibilities, when held carefully, expand understanding without demanding belief. The widening remains controlled. The ground remains firm. Yet the horizon stretches slightly further than before. When ancient texts describe descent from heaven, catastrophic flood, and re-establishment of order, they are not only narrating singular events. They are constructing an architecture of recurrence. The sequence appears again and again. Foundation, expansion, imbalance, rupture, recalibration. This has happened before. In Mesopotamia, cities rose along shifting river channels. Uruk expanded, then contracted. Akkadian authority consolidated under Sargon, then fragmented. Babylon flourished, fell, and was rebuilt. Assyria dominated the Near East, then collapsed violently in 612 BCE. The archaeological record reveals continuity threaded with interruption. Recurrence does not imply exact repetition. It implies patterned vulnerability. Modern infrastructure feels durable: steel, concrete, digital networks. Yet it remains contingent upon climate stability, resource distribution, and social cohesion. Drought destabilized the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE, as evidenced by sediment cores and settlement abandonment across northern Mesopotamia. Environmental stress intersects with political fragility. The watchers within this broader architecture symbolize awareness of oversight during transition. When societies sense imbalance, they project surveillance into cosmology. The divine council deliberates. Judgment is pronounced. The flood arrives. To order resets. Civilizations remember in fragments, but they also remember in cycles. One interpretation suggests that recurrence narratives function as adaptive memory. By encoding the inevitability of disruption, cultures prepare psychologically for change. Another way to read this is as structural realism. Agrarian societies learn through experience that stability is temporary. The sky was once closer, not because it intervened physically, but because its patterns offered continuity when political systems faltered. Stars rose and set regardless of dynastic collapse. Celestial regularity contrasted with terrestrial volatility. If we consider the possibility that the watchers represent institutional consciousness, the awareness that systems require monitoring, then their persistence reflects enduring human concern. Oversight is necessary. This attention must be sustained. Without it, imbalance accumulates. We are not the first to construct complex societies that assume permanence. The architecture of recurrence suggests otherwise. This perspective does not predict inevitable collapse. It does not deny human resilience. It observes that history, both ancient and recent, unfolds in rhythms: urbanization, expansion, crisis, adaptation. The flood narrative becomes metaphor for systemic reset. The watchers become symbols of awareness preceding disruption. The pattern invites neither fear nor complacency. It invites recognition. When reading Mesopotamian texts through this lens, the mythic and the material align more closely. Catastrophe need not be supernatural to be transformative. Collapse need not be total to be consequential. This has happened before, and awareness of that recurrence may itself be the most enduring inheritance of the Watchers. As the narrative widens and then steadies, it begins to turn inward. The Watchers, whether understood as administrative metaphors, mythic intermediaries, or structural echoes of environmental rupture, also inhabit the human psyche. They represent more than cosmological function. They reflect a need. In complex societies, individuals confront systems too vast to grasp fully. Grain flows through warehouses. Edicts travel from palace to province. Omens are interpreted by specialists whose training spans decades. Authority becomes diffuse and abstract. In such environments, projecting oversight into the heavens may offer coherence. The Watcher becomes a reassuring figure, not necessarily benevolent, not necessarily punitive, simply attentive. Attention carries psychological weight. To be seen implies significance. To be observed implies order. Ancient texts describe divine councils deliberating human fate. Even when judgment is severe, the underlying premise remains: events are noticed. The sky was once closer, perhaps because it was inhabited by presences who watched. Modern secular frameworks often remove such presences from cosmology, replacing them with impersonal forces. Yet the impulse toward oversight persists in other forms: legal systems, surveillance technologies, institutional accountability. The language changes. The function endures. This has happened before. Cultures externalize responsibility, then internalize it again. One interpretation suggests that Watcher myths reflect anxiety about knowledge itself. When specialized classes control literacy and ritual, the broader population may imagine higher authorities overseeing those authorities. Another way to read this is existential. Human beings, aware of mortality and uncertainty, create narratives in which existence unfolds within a larger field of awareness. Civilizations remember in fragments. Individuals do as well. Memory is partial. Perspective is limited. The Watcher compensates symbolically for these limits, embodying a vantage point beyond individual constraint. Consider for a moment the sensation of looking up at a night sky unpolluted by artificial light. The stars appear innumerable. Constellations trace familiar shapes. You sense both smallness and connection. That duality, insignificance within immensity, yet participation in a larger order, mirrors the emotional function of the Watcher. We are not the first to seek reassurance in patterned skies. The Mesopotamians inscribed that reassurance into clay. They named intermediaries, they structured councils, they imagined oversight. Whether those structures arose purely from socio-political projection or from deeper cognitive architecture, their persistence suggests necessity. The Watcher stabilizes narrative when events destabilize life. As the tempo slows, the Watchers begin to resemble less external beings and more internal archetypes. Figures representing vigilance, memory, and continuity. They stand between heaven and earth, but perhaps also between uncertainty and meaning. When we extend our gaze beyond the span of a single civilization, time itself begins to shift in texture. 12,000 years separate us from the end of the Younger Dryas. So 5,000 years separate us from the earliest cities of Sumer. Within those intervals lie countless unnamed lives. Farmers, scribes, laborers, ritual specialists, each inhabiting a present as immediate as our own. The Watchers, situated in texts composed thousands of years ago, become markers of that depth. we are not the first to ask where we stand in time. The Sumerian king list, with its expanded antediluvian reigns and contracted historical ones, reflects a consciousness of temporal layering. The scribes who copied those lists were aware that they lived after something, after a flood, after a rupture, after an age described as different. They perceived themselves within a continuum. Modern historical frameworks often compress this continuum into charts and timelines. Prehistory yields to antiquity. Antiquity yields to classical civilization. The progression appears linear. Yet beneath that linearity lies recurrence, adaptation, recalibration. This has happened before. Empires imagine themselves unprecedented. Later generations revise that confidence. If you allow the perspective to widen further, beyond 5,000 years, beyond agriculture, beyond the earliest known monuments, you encounter deep human continuity. Genetic lineages trace backward tens of thousands of years. Tools change, languages shift, stories evolve. Yet the capacity to reflect, to question, to project oversight into narrative remains. Civilizations remember in fragments. Identity forms around those fragments. The Watchers may represent ancient attempts to situate human existence within a broader temporal frame. By populating heaven with observers, societies created continuity that transcended individual lifespan. The divine council existed before any single king and persisted after his death. The sky was once closer, perhaps because it offered temporal stability. As pacing slows, the focus shifts from what the Watchers were to what they reveal about human self-understanding. The desire to locate oneself within an ordered cosmos persists across eras. Whether expressed through divine intermediaries or scientific cosmology, the impulse is similar. Imagine standing on a riverbank at dusk, knowing that generations before you stood in the same place, watching the same current. The names change, the questions remain. We are not the first to ask. The recognition carries humility. It also carries connection. In acknowledging time depth, should the Watchers soften from mysterious beings into reminders of continuity? They become symbols of inherited inquiry, evidence that reflection itself has ancient roots. And as we move toward the closing movement of this exploration, the question becomes less about who the Watchers were and more about how their presence shapes our understanding of ourselves. Before this exploration settles into its final cadence, it is necessary to return to firm ground. The archaeological record of Mesopotamia demonstrates gradual cultural development. Writing emerged from accounting practices. Urbanization expanded through irrigation management and trade networks. Flood deposits reflect regional hydrology rather than global cataclysm. Genetic continuity supports demographic resilience rather than species-level rupture. Yes, there is no credible evidence of extraterrestrial intervention in early Sumerian civilization. There is no archaeological trace of advanced lost technologies predating known urbanization. The Watcher figures described in cuneiform and later texts are best understood within mythological, institutional, and psychological frameworks supported by scholarship. Speculation must remain disciplined. The widening considered earlier does not overturn the consensus. It invites nuance without abandoning evidence. Myth can encode environmental memory. Numbers can carry symbolic weight. Narrative structures can reveal recurring patterns of human concern. None of these possibilities require rejection of established research. This has happened before. History accumulates interpretation. Revision refines rather than erases. The Watchers, when stabilized within academic context, remain part of a richly layered cosmology shaped by socio-political realities, astronomical observation, and theological evolution. Their recurrence across cultures reflects transmission and adaptation, not hidden progenitors. Civilizations remember in fragments. Scholars assemble those fragments cautiously. The tension between grounded explanation and expansive interpretation need not collapse into certainty or dismissal. It can remain productive, an open space where evidence anchors imagination. The sky was once closer. In acknowledging metaphor, we preserve its resonance without literalizing it. We are not the first to ask how myth and history intertwine, nor will we be the last. The ground holds, and the questions remain measured. In room 55 of the British Museum, at the clay tablet labelled K.1602 remains unchanged. Its edges are still chipped. Its surface still bears the pressed wedges of an Assyrian scribe, who could not have imagined electric light or climate-controlled glass. The artifact does not know the debates it has inspired. It does not shift its meaning in response to modern curiosity. It simply endures. When you stand before it now, whether physically or in imagination, the lines describing intermediaries between heaven and earth appear no more dramatic than they did in antiquity. They sit among inventories, hymns, and administrative notes. The Watchers are embedded in context, neither highlighted nor concealed. Civilizations remember in fragments. This tablet is one such fragment. Its presence within Ashurbanipal's library connects it to a network of scholars who recopied older traditions to preserve them. The library itself was an act of consolidation, an attempt to gather dispersed knowledge into a single archive. When Nineveh burned, that archive fractured. Fire both destroyed and preserved. This has happened before. Knowledge accumulates, knowledge scatters. The Watcher figures inscribed here reflect a cosmology structured around observation and hierarchy. Whether read as metaphor, institutional projection, or layered memory, they do not require embellishment. Their quiet persistence across centuries is enough. The sky was once closer. The phrase echoes differently now. It no longer suggests literal proximity. It suggests orientation, an ancient attentiveness to pattern and oversight that shaped both ritual and administration. Imagine once more the feel of clay beneath a hand, the pressure of stylus against soft surface. The act was deliberate. Each sign impressed into the tablet represented continuity with earlier inscriptions. The scribe participated in an inherited tradition, copying words that were already old. We are not the first to ask. The tablet testifies to that. It does not resolve the Watchers into singular meaning. It situates them within a lineage of reflection. The clay, the text, the fragment, each invites patient reading. And patience, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson preserved within its surface. Night settles slowly over the Mesopotamian plain. The river moves without announcement, carrying silt and memory toward the gulf. The heat of the day releases into the open air. Reeds along the banks rustle in faint currents of wind. The sky darkens. Stars appear one by one. In antiquity, the absence of artificial light would have rendered the heavens immense. Constellations traced familiar paths across seasons. The path of Enlil, the path of Anu, the path of Ea, mapped in patient observation, would rise in sequence, steady and unhurried. The sky was once closer, not because it descended, but because it was watched. If you imagine standing along the Tigris at such an hour, the city behind you quiet, the water reflecting faint starlight, you might sense the same continuity that ancient observers felt. Empires pass, tablets fracture, floods reshape banks, yet the stars repeat their arcs. Civilizations remember in fragments. The river remembers in motion. The watchers, whether understood as divine intermediaries or as symbols of vigilance, dissolve gently into the night. Their presence becomes less figure and more awareness, an attentiveness that spans generations. This has happened before, and it will happen again. Breath slows. The river continues. The sky remains patterned above shifting ground. There is no final declaration here, only the quiet recognition that between heaven and earth, humanity has always sought orientation, through clay, through stars, through story. And in that seeking, something enduring persists. Beneath the polished floors of modern museums, beneath the layered cities of Iraq, beneath the wind-shaped mounds that mark ancient tells, countless tablets remain unexcavated. Clay sleeps in darkness. Walls lie folded beneath sand. Archives persist beyond reach, sealed by time and circumstance. The unfinished archive is not a metaphor alone. It is physical. Archaeology advances slowly. Political instability halts excavation. Technologies improve, then return to sites once thought exhausted. Each generation uncovers only a fraction of what once existed. For every tablet displayed in room 55, thousands remain buried or fragmented beyond reconstruction. Civilizations remember in fragments. Some fragments are still hidden. The Watchers, as figures within surviving texts, represent only one thread within a broader tapestry of ancient thought. Other threads may yet emerge. New translations may refine old assumptions. Radiocarbon calibration curves may shift chronologies subtly. Interpretations evolve. This has happened before. Scholarly consensus adjusts without collapsing. The sky was once closer, perhaps because uncertainty was acknowledged openly within myth. The divine council deliberated. Outcomes were not always predictable. Humanity navigated ambiguity through narrative rather than finality. If you imagine the desert at dawn, wind moving across low mounds that conceal forgotten walls, the sense is not of mystery demanding resolution, but of continuity awaiting patience. Clay endures. Questions endure. Interpretation unfolds gradually. We are not the first to ask, nor will we be the last. The unfinished archive remains beneath our feet and within our texts. It invites humility. It resists closure. It reminds us that history is not a completed ledger, but an ongoing excavation. The tablet in room 55 rests unchanged. The Watchers remain inscribed. The river still moves beneath the stars. And somewhere beneath sand and silence, some additional fragments wait, not to overturn what is known, but to extend it quietly, as all knowledge does. Breath steadies. The night deepens. The archive continues. If you find yourself reflecting on these patterns as the night deepens, allow the questions to settle without urgency. There is no need to resolve them immediately. The fragments will remain. The sky will rise again tomorrow. And the conversation between earth and heaven continues in its own time.